Hi, and welcome to this new show about Atlantis and Poseidon and the Phoenicians, an adventure into the unknown. So what's important about this presentation that I'm going to show you is that I wanted to analyze the story of Atlantis from scratch. We've seen many movies, many legends, many cartoons about Atlantis, but maybe we don't really know exactly what it is. So what it is exactly, it's a text written by Plato, the ancient Greek philosopher, and it was written 400 years before Christ. Well, so in order to understand Atlantis, we may want to understand the author of the story, Plato. So Plato was born in 428 BC, and he died 70 years later. We don't exactly know his dates exactly. His death is thought to be in 348 BC. So Plato is considered the father of Western philosophy. Some other people may also consider Socrates as the founder of Western philosophy. But the problem is that Socrates never wrote anything. He's a very important figure in philosophy because in Athens he would walk around the agora and he would question everyone, about their opinions, about what truth was, about what justice was. But he was he was sent to court because of supposedly corrupting the youth. Inventing new gods, not believing in the gods of the ancient Greeks and things like that. So what happened is that he was sentenced to death, and he drank the poison himself. And Socrates' death was witnessed by Plato. So we may believe that when Plato was still young, he might have been shocked by the execution of Socrates. One of the ideas that Socrates had was that death, he said, is the cure to free the immortal soul from the body. So this is why Plato had this belief of a world in which we cannot see, but that exists. It's the world of spirits. So some other things we know about Plato is that he traveled to Sicily several times to teach the Dionysus' family's children. So Dionysus was the ruler of Sicily. Yeah? And when Plato went back to Athens, he opened the academy where he taught Aristotle, who is another very famous Greek philosopher, who was also the tutor of Alexander the Great. So let's go back to Plato. So Plato is famous for many books. His famous dialogues, in which Timaeus and Critias was written. So this is in this book that there is the story of Atlantis. So, but so it was supposed to be written in 360 BC. But even though it was written then, the story is supposed to have taken place 60 years before, which means that the story of the people who are talking about Atlantis takes place during the Peace of Nicaea in 422 BC. So what we see in what we can read when we read these dialogues is that Socrates. So Socrates is very often he's one of the protagonists of Plato's stories, and in fact, if we go to Italy, and if we go to the Vatican, there is a painting painted in 1510 by Raphael. It's called the School of Athens, and in that mural we can see all the four protagonists of the Timaeus and Critias. So the protagonists are Socrates, so we see him because he's the bald guy. Next to him is Timaeus, another old guy with a beard. Critias is very young, and Hermocrates is Critias is very old too, and Hermocrates is the younger one, right? So who talks first is Critias. Listen then, Socrates, to a tale of Solon, who, being the friend of Tropidas, my great-grandfather, told it to my grandfather, Critias, and he told me. So basically what we see here is that it's a story that was passed on from a generation to another and to another, that we may imagine Plato to have heard it when he was young, 60, when he was young. And it took him, so he was already an old man, Plato, when he wrote that story. But we may imagine that he had heard bribes of it, pieces of it, when he was young. So it's a story that was told by an old man who told it to his grandson, who also became an old man and who told it to his grandson. And now in the story, we see that Critias, who is telling the story, is a very old man too. But actually, this is Plato writing about an old man telling the story. So we see what it is. We can see it here in this little diagram. The old man of Sais told the story to Solon, who told it to Tropides, the great-grandfather of Critias, who then, at 90 years old, told the story to his great okay, so Critias was 10 when he heard the story, and when he became an old man, in the story here that Plato wrote, he is telling the story to Socrates, Timaeus, and Hermocrates. So if we look at the characters, so Timaeus is a real person. He's a philosopher of the Pythagorean school who gave the name to the first dialogue in Timaeus. However, nothing proves that Timaeus existed. We may assume Timaeus is a fictional mashup of people that Plato knew, his friends, his colleagues at the academy, or other people that Plato met in his life. We're not sure if Timaeus really existed. What we know is that Socrates existed. We know that Critias existed. Critias is Plato's mother's uncle, so basically Plato's great uncle. He's the very old man telling the story. And Hermocrates is a Syracusan general who fought with Sparta against the Athenians during the Sicilian expedition between 415 and 413 BC, a battle that Athens lost. Hermocrates fought with Sparta, so he won that battle. So the story is told by Critias, but what Critias is saying, he's saying that Solon, an Athenian lawmaker, heard the story when he went out of Athens, when he went to Egypt. And that story was then told to him by an old priest that we know by the name of the Old Man of Sais. And Critias' great-grandfather heard the story 10 years later. The story is a strange tale, Critias says, but certainly true, as declared by Solon, one of the 7 wisest sage. Yeah, so Solon was an Athenian lawmaker, so we can imagine that all of these people are people that are important people. So what do we learn from Critias then about Atlantis? The first thing we know is that Atlantis, the island of Atlantis, was said to be bigger than both Libya and Asia. So we're talking about huge dimensions. Libya is, in fact, is what was called Africa in those days. And Asia, in fact, in those days, we didn't really know the limits. We didn't really know how big Asia was. But what Plato wrote is that Atlantis, Plato wrote it, but apparently this is what he heard. So apparently this island of Atlantis was bigger than 2 continents put together. Okay, the second information is that there were many great like floods that had taken place during those 9,000 years. So that's a separate the time of Plato from, in fact, the time of, the old men of Sais. We can imagine that a couple of 100 years before, like a couple of generations before Plato. So 1, maybe 200 years before Plato, and you add 9,000 years. So basically we're talking about something that took place over 9,000 BC. Yeah? So like at least 11,000 years ago. So what we see in the story is that there was earthquakes and things like that. And after this sort of natural disaster, floods and earthquakes, only left unnavigable muddy seas that prevented the numerous barbarians and Greek tribes to cross that area and prevented peoples to fight. Gods divided the planet between each of them, region after region, for people not to dispute them. So the oldest king received the island and gave its name to it, and the sea that we now call the Atlantic Sea. So because the first king of the country was called Atlas, all right, so the oldest king received the island and gave its name to it. So the oldest king is Atlas. And 10 kings, other 10 kings were given pieces of the land. Each of the 10 kings had their own division in their own city. And over each city, they had the absolute control of the citizens. And in many cases, they managed the laws and could punish and slay whomsoever they wanted to. There was a social structure. Now, the appearance, it was being swallowed up by earthquakes. In comparison of what then was, the only remains are the bones of the wasted body, as they may be called. As all the richer and softer parts of the soil having fallen away, the mere skeleton of the land was left. What is left now compared to what existed then looks like a body of discarnated disease. Okay, so if we're going to look back about each information we learn using those pictures. So the first shock is the dimensions. So if we look here at this old picture, we can see Libya and Asia. So what happens is that we have to move, copy. What we have to do is like do something like a copy paste. So we have to copy and paste the size of both Libya and Asia. So if we copy paste, we would almost get the dimensions of, the total continent of America, including South, Central, and North America. So, but usually when we think of islands, we have this idea of, islands like Hawaii or maybe Crete or like Madagascar. So we usually don't call a continent, we don't usually call it an island. But Plato calls it an island, even though he is saying that it is as big as a continent. It's huge. It's completely out of proportions. Now, the other information he gives us is 9,000 years ago. This is another surprise because, well, okay, let's look at the some dates that we can get from religious teachings. Basically, like Christianity tells us that the universe was created something like around 4,000 years ago. It's not very precise. So basically, Plato tells us that this thing of Atlantis existed before the biblical floods. So the biblical floods took place, like, it depends from which source you take it from, but most of the sources, they tell us that the biblical floods took place 2,000 to 3,000 BC. So if the question was, is it the biblical floods that destroyed Atlantis, according to the dates given by the Christians and the dates given by Plato, we don't find the same dates. So we may think that Atlantis didn't disappear because of the biblical floods. All right. Then there is the idea of Poseidon. Okay, so we know that Atlantis was given to the god Poseidon, which is the god of the seas, the god of thunder. So let's look at the description of Poseidon. Poseidon travels on a chariot pulled by horses, wearing shoes of bronze, and on his way, dolphins would joyfully jump out of the sea. This is the picture of Poseidon. What we know of Poseidon is that when all the gods were invited to decide who. So Attica is this part of Greece in which Athens is. And there was a meeting to vote for who would take over the control of Attica, whether it was going to be Athena or Poseidon. And what happens is that Athena won. This is why the capital of Greece is called Athens. But so what happened was that, of course, Poseidon wasn't very happy, and so we may imagine that this is why he went back to the. In fact, the story goes that he disappeared in the ocean. He went to hide in the ocean because he was so unhappy. So what we know is the origins of Poseidon is in Pylos. We can see it on this picture here. In fact, when we look at the map of Greek, but the territory of Greece looks like a skeleton, especially like those three peninsulas. They look like a skeleton hand. this one here also kind of look like a skeleton hand. I mean, all of these islands look like a big mess, a big mashup of, you know, dispersed islands. So maybe instead of looking for Atlantis in the Atlantic Ocean, maybe Atlantic is just somewhere there in Greece. Okay. Or is it only a legend? But this is why we're doing this analysis to know. All right, so there is a link, though, between Poseidon, or is there? That's another question. Is there a link between Poseidon and the city of Sidon in Phoenicia? So let's understand the words Poseidon. Posis means husband, and da means the earth. So Posis da, it means the husband of the earth. And yeah, if we think of like a woman being the wife of Poseidon, maybe she could be Athena, who received the earth, and Poseidon received the ocean. So it would make sense that Poseidon, being the god of the seas and the water that covers the earth, could then be the husband of the earth. However, this theory, the prefix po isn't added to Sidon, right? So Sidon would, right. So there's something wrong. Maybe many people said, oh yeah, so Atlantis, the Atlanteans and the Phoenicians are the same peoples. But because there are links between Poseidon and the Phoenicians. So Agenor, the son of Libya and Poseidon, got married to Telephassa, and they have 4 children: Cadmus, Cilix, Europe, and Phoenix. So Phoenix could also, the word looks similar to the word Phoenician. And it's true, because Agenor is also the Phoenician king of Tyre. And Herodotus, the first, the Greek, the person who's known as the first historian, estimates that Agenor lived sometime before the year 2000 BC. So Poseidon is the father of the king of Tyre, one of the main Phoenician cities. That means that Phoenicia is a land in which the god Poseidon has control as well. Atlantis is the land on which Poseidon has control. Poseidon also controls Atlantis. Is there any link between Poseidon and the Phoenicians and Atlantis? This is the whole story here. Now there is also the question of the biblical floods and the destruction of the Atlantis. So Canaan's oldest son, Sidon, founded Sidon, the first capital city of the Phoenicians. And as a consequence of being the son of Noah, we can say that there is a link between the Phoenician civilization and Sidon. There is only the one question, was that there is a problem related to the date. That the biblical floods took place almost 6,000 years after the date when the disappearance of Atlantis took place. All right, now we're going to look at the geopolitical context of Atlantis. So Atlantis was a mighty power which was aggressing the whole of Europe and Asia. This power came forth out of the Atlantic Ocean, for in those days the Atlantic was navigable. Now in the island of Atlantis there was a great and wonderful empire, which had rule over the whole island and several others, as well as over parts of the continent. And besides these, they subjected the parts of Libya within the columns of Heracles, as far as Egypt, and of Europe as far as Tyrrhenia. Tyrrhenia is the sea next to Italy, and of course the columns of Heracles is the Straits of Gibraltar. So this is the Mediterranean Sea. So, but there was a worldwide war. The vast power thus gathered into one endeavored to subdue at one blow our country and yours, and the whole of the land which was within the Straits of Gibraltar, what we now call the Straits of Gibraltar. Now so this power went into the Mediterranean Sea to wage war against Greece and the other civilizations that were there surrounding the Mediterranean Sea. The other interesting point